hate crimes, right?
Okay, so we were here yesterday when we left off. We know that trade makes everyone better off, and we had talked through the fact that the winners could compensate the losers and still have everyone be better off, but we acknowledge that that almost never happens. Right? We talked about how the people who are affected are often very concentrated and their impact make their impact felt, and the people who benefit often benefit marginally so and are very widespread and take it as a matter of course and don't make a huge deal out of it. So it's the losers who have the greatest incentive to band together, to be vocal, to force change. And so often these decisions are prompted by a tremendous minority. Okay, so one example of a trade restriction would be the implementation of a tariff. What is a tariff? It's a tax. It's a tax that's imposed on imports. It's a little bit like taxing consumption. Tariff is a tax on imports. Okay. Let's take cotton shirts. Anybody own a cotton shirt? Probably everyone owns a cotton shirt.
All
You
mine
might
are
be
made.
wearing one at this very moment, Bailey.
All of my shirts are goat's hair. Did you die? Did you die?
What'd you say?
Obscure. Did you die? Nobody died.
You
Did
don't.
you die?
Stop it, delete it right now.
Did you?
Save it.
She just talked to you all at the same time.
Yes.
So quit wasting Mrs. Hoke's time and making her life miserable. Get your stuff done. Or else.
I wanna be in the chat.
Bad. Two of them bad.
Hey, Trevor, how did you not get parents on
Says Nick's a junior. Mr. Hubert didn't summon them at the same time.
Oh, Mr. Hugo will get you next. Wait, if you're only missing one, do you still get called down there?
I didn't even turn you in. Yes. But you're still on the list of the game.
Yeah, I know.
Alright. So, the world price of cotton shirts is $20. Put a tariff of $10 on each shirt. Are some of you already imagining what this looks like on the graph? On the chart?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the price going to be for this shirt when it's imported? $30. Okay. Well, that shirt got expensive all of a sudden. Okay. So domestic producers can now charge $30 a shirt. What if they were able to sell a shirt at $25 before? Are they going to sell it at $25? What do you suppose they might sell it at? Or so the price facing domestic buyers and sellers is the world price plus the tax. We assume that they'll be completely competitive and go at that $30 price. Which is where the Buy Made in the USA or Buy American campaign comes from. They're going to sell it at the same price as the imported goods and trust that your sense of duty and obligation will get you to pay the same price for it and choose the American good. Okay? All right, so here's our world price. So we should be, by the world price, importing, correct? Okay? Buyers are going to want 80 of those internationally made cotton shirts at the world price of $20. Domestic producers at $20 are only able to produce 25 shirts. It's all they can afford to make at that price. So we got to import 55 of them. But the domestic producers are going to cry. They're going to be like, you're going to put us out of business, right? This not fair. You're gonna force us to lay off employees. This is bad, bad. We need to tax the imports of these foreign-made cotton shirts, child labor, slave labor, all that. Okay? So we tax the shirts, $10 a shirt. It raises the price. So this is the world price plus tax. We still are not up to equilibrium, so we're still going to import some shirts, aren't we? We're gonna import that many shirts right there in that gap. Okay? So now, buyers want 70 cotton shirts at $30 a piece. Producers will produce 40 shirts. So we're still gonna import 30 cotton shirts. Are you seeing the impact on producer surplus here? Okay. Oh, so many letters.
Hallelujah.
I'll give you a moment to get it down.
I mean, we're ready. Wow. Let's get it.
There'll be some dead weight loss going on here, huh? This is an even bigger dead weight loss. This is global.
Global.
When I was growing up, there was a Matthew Broderick movie called War Games. It's been remade since. And the computer wanted to play chess with you or tic-tac-toe or something. Global thermal nuclear war. That's always the voice that I hear. Dead weight loss.
The only way to win is
After you let
to
everyone
cheat.
cheat.
Why not to win?
Yeah, there's like all from the red line, and then to the demand, everything after that's
That's a good question.
Don't move.
Jared, so at the red line,
One more.
consumer surplus is everyone but G.
Oh, wow.
Really bad.
That's what it's doing, right?
Well, not
It smells like my grandma's.
consumers.
Wait,
oh,
no.
maybe eight.
Oh, yeah, she loves that
Yeah,
shit.
you're right.
Everyone, all the letters surplus. Okay.
It's not.
At red line.
All right, so got our letters down?
Because that's definitely lost.
What is?
So consumer surplus is tremendous at the world price. Oh my gosh, the consumers are so far ahead. There is so much prosperity between their willingness to buy and the actual price. Producers, not so much. We can kind of see why the producers are not interested in world trade, because the producers are missing everything from here down to the red line. That's where they would have had at the equilibrium. You can see that they might be a little sore about that. Right? So what do they gain from the tariff? They gain C. Okay? So there's our total surplus with world trade. When we add the tariff in, consumer surplus is greatly diminished. We recover some of that lost consumer surplus in our producer surplus with the tariff. But we've got some dead weight loss cooking over here. Remember, with taxation, that middle rectangle is revenue that goes to the government. So that's not entirely lost. It is part of total surplus. We keep producer or consumer surplus, we keep producer surplus, we keep the revenue. But now we have two triangles of dead weight loss. Okay, so our total surplus is everything in the green there. And our dead weight loss. Pretty quick at writing up that mangled hand there. So, tariffs good or bad? Depends entirely upon which side of the equation you're on.
Yeah.
If you're a producer, tariff good. If you're a consumer, tariff bad. If you're an economist, tariff bad.
It's not rough.
Tarzan, tariff bad. Yes, the book does not like tariffs whatsoever. Well, they're an interference with efficiency,
Yeah, that's what
right?
I'm saying. So,
And anytime we interfere with efficiency, we lose our maximum total surplus.
so if they took away all the tariffs and everything will be efficient again?
Everything would be more efficient than it is.
Why are they there?
Cause we're trying to bring manufacturing.
Yeah, in case we need, but it's not a lot.
Cause we're trying to make America.
All right.
great again. Duh.
So, here's where the deadweight loss comes from. This deadweight loss comes from the overproduction of shirts. This deadweight loss comes from the underconsumption of shirts. We're underconsuming, we're overproducing. Together, we create a fair amount of deadweight loss.
I can't relate to that.
Underconsumption of shirts? Well, for
Not
you,
just
it would be
shirts, just
underconsumption of
underconsumption.
jackets and
Or
cardigans
food.
and shoes.
No.
Alright. If we don't like tariffs, we can instead institute import quotas. What is a quota?
How much we have to make.
Yeah, for production, a quota is a maximum. For importation, a quota is still a maximum, but it's a maximum, I'm sorry, for production, a quota is a minimum level. You must achieve that quota. For importation, it's a maximum. This is the maximum amount you may import. So it's a quantitative, in terms of quantity, a limit on the imports of a good.
Too late
Too late for what?
for Buddy. He already got to it.
I'm sorry, how bad was it?
No, he took it outside. I got video of it later. I'll show you.
Did your dog kill something?
No, I scooped up an entire large, did you bring some lunch for me then?
No, I didn't bring anything because I didn't know there's anything left.
Yeah, the whole pot in the, so I scooped up an
We'll do it
entire
later.
Tupperware of homemade vegetable beef soup
Mhm.
and forgot and left it on the counter.
Dog.
And as soon as I
Mhm.
remembered it, I went down and asked Tico to go home and retrieve it
Mhm.
before the dog.
And Buddy was like,
He took it outside and opened the Tupperware and
at least
Opened
it's
it outside, so there was no mess in the
Good
kitchen.
dog.
yeah, you trained him
Good
well
job,
about
Buddy. Good
that.
job. He's like, I'm
Yeah.
gonna be a sneaky son of a
So is
gun,
there
but I'll be
soup all
polite
over the
about
yard
it.
or the deck?
No,
I like that.
Oh,
he,
he ate it
he
all.
dragged it all. I don't know how he did it. He must have picked the whole thing up and dragged it down in the grass.
Ripped
Can
that
you bring
container.
Buddy someday?
Oh yeah, he did a little bit, but not too bad. You see little teeth marks on it, but not too bad.
Well, what are we getting for lunch then?
I don't know. Next time, put it in a lock
I'm
and
just
lock.
trying to be good.
Back.
Huh?
Do a lock and lock so that way he doesn't ruin it when he opens it.
Alright, ultimately the import tariff has essentially the same impact as a tariff. It raises the price, it reduces the quantity of the imports, it reduces buyers' welfare. So when you think about the graph that you just drew for the last one, when we talk about it raising the price, how does it raise the price if it's not a tax? Well, what happens is, at that world price of 20, we wanted to import like 50 shirts, right? 55 shirts. We say you can only import 30. So price automatically comes up to make supply and demand gap by 30. It's just then that there's no revenue going to the government. All of that additional profit goes to the producers. Okay? Tariffs reduce buyer welfare and increase seller welfare. They reduce consumer surplus. They increase producer surplus.
So
But-
why would a government put this there if it's not gonna give them money?
There's a good question, because the tariff at least creates revenue for the government. But when you put in a quota, the increased price goes back to the foreign exporter and increases the welfare of that foreign country. So if tariffs are bad, quotas are awful.
So why do we use them?
I have to ask your politicians. Maybe that'd be a good assignment. Dear Representative Bacon.
Yo, Donnie boy.
Dear Senator,
No, I didn't have,
I noticed that you voted recently for the
I wrote
import tariff package.
He voted
I
for
got
it?
a reply from this.
I don't.
Is he?
But it was about that.
Yes.
So you wouldn't have asked for
Actually, every one of our representatives right now are Republican, all senators and.
Ashford got voted.
This is a fun one that government doesn't do a lot. They could auction import licenses. They would make the revenue from selling that license, from auctioning that license. The auction is an efficient way to give that license because it goes to the seller who is most willing to pay for it, right? The importer who's most willing to pay for it. And it raises the most revenue possible for that license. But the government doesn't do it very often. What?
Will new tariffs hurt the U.S. solar industry?
Oh, and Sean's looking at today's Wall Street Journal, and I think that's on the back of the business finance section.
Oh my god.
Oh no, sorry, it's on the back of the energy section.
Yeah.
Special report, and the heading says, "Will new tariffs hurt the U.S. solar industry?" What a gift to you from the Wall Street Journal, for those of you who have a current event due this week. Some of you are still struggling with relating to class, that second paragraph, but I hope you're taking the time to read the comments that I put,
I did.
so that you can get your full credit the next time. Well, by the way, Wall Street Journal stops this week, won't start again until the spring if I earn another grant, or if I'm awarded another grant.
So you're the only one to apply.
I was gonna say, considering no one else is applying, we got this in the
Well,
bag.
You don't know that nationwide.
I thought it was statewide.
Wait, we got it nationwide the first time?
Nationwide.
Whoa.
That's the first thing that came to my head.
Alright, so the arguments in favor of restricting trade. Jobs argument. We need to protect American jobs. Okay? Trade destroys jobs in industries that have to compete with imported goods. If we allow imports of foreign goods to compete with American-made goods, they're cheaper. Of course, they're going to sell better. They're going to drive us out of business, and we'll have to lay people off. That sells, doesn't it? Especially if you work in one of those industries, that sells. Economists' answer to that is, let's look at the numbers. Are the imports really causing increasing unemployment? $40 years, 50 years worth of import data. 50 years worth of unemployment data.
Numbers never lie.
Fake news? Is that fake? Or is the claim that importation causes job loss fake news?
Well, that's.
So what you have is importation causing job loss is anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence. My brother's cousin's sister-in-law's friend worked at, and, right?
Wow, congratulations on well, big news.
Okay?
What are they wrong?
So economists say total unemployment doesn't rise as imports increase. What happens is importation allows the death of those industries that aren't competitive, allows the strengthening of the industries that are competitive, and the job losses in the non-competitive industry are mitigated by job increases in the competitive industry. It makes what is strong stronger and kills off what is weak. Think of it kind of as economic social Darwinism.
I was just.
Does that mean that it is not painful for the people who receive the immediate impact? Absolutely not. It's quite devastating for them. But if you are looking at the large economic picture, we're better off. All right. So even if everything we make could be made more cheaply overseas, we're still going to have the comparative advantage in something that we can trade, and we would still ultimately be better off. You don't have to have absolute advantage, just comparative advantage. I have to be that much better than you to profit at it. Okay? National security. Oh, by golly, we can't be importing good X. It's critical and vital to our national security. We have to be able to make it here. What if war erupts and we can't get it? Rubber importation during World War II. Majority of rubber in the world comes from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia area. Big issue, big issue. Silk. Where's most of the silk in the world come from? China. Okay. What did we do when we couldn't get silk during World War II? We stopped selling women's silk stockings. And what were pantyhose called for a long time from the 40s through like the 70s? Women didn't wear pantyhose, they wore nylons. They wore nylons.
Oh.
And what were parachutes made of? They were made of silk until nylon was invented. Okay. We have to be sure that we're really talking about true security needs. Do we want our army to be carrying foreign-made weapons that can only fire foreign-made ammunition? That's probably a pretty legitimate concern, right? Do we want foreign nations writing the software that runs the autopilot in our fighter jets and bombers?
Yes.
That might be a legitimate national security concern. Do we really care where the boots that the soldiers wear are made?
That's what I was thinking.
The issue here is, this is a valid argument as long as you really evaluate the legitimacy of the argument. And don't just base your determination on the producer's arguments. They're going to exaggerate how important what they make is. Makes sense, right? You have done this yourself in arguments with your parents or your friends. No, Mom, you have to let me go. My team can't possibly carry it out without me. I have to put them on my back. I won that argument once in high school. I marched with a fever of 102.8. No, the band can't possibly march without me. The drum line will have a gap. I have to go.
She passed out and ruined the
Oh,
show.
No, I made it.
She fell down the hill and rolled.
No, that was for practice. That was a great drum roll. It hurt. All right, 3, the infant industry argument. The infant industry. Infants have to be protected. We carry them in special car seats, and we
There's a
bundle
special,
them
like,
specifically, and we build their cribs to a certain extent. Infants have to be protected and cared for in nurture. We have to do the same thing with baby industries. Except economists are pretty heartless about this. They say, if it's ever going to be strong enough to compete with foreign industry, it should be strong enough to compete from the beginning. You don't have to let it grow up to compete. Baby Superman? Strong enough.
I was waiting for your face.
Give me the Baba. If it's going to be strong enough, it should be strong enough from the beginning. Okay? Plus, how does the government have the knowledge and wherewithal to determine which industries need to be protected and which don't, which are going to be able to grow to be competitive and which aren't? The answer there is they don't. Some days, kind of look at the government and wonder how it continues to function on its own, let alone what? If a firm is going to eventually be profitable, it should be able to suffer some short-term losses. Okay, 4, the unfair competition argument. It's not fair that my industry has to compete with that foreign industry because they get support from their government, or they don't have environmental regulations, or they don't have labor unions to deal with, or they don't have, right?
So,
It's not fair.
Just cringe so hard.
How is that different than you throwing a temper tantrum when an industry says, it's not fair, their government helps them, their government isn't saddling them with restrictions?
I know, Arthur just stood up and said.
Economists say, all right, bring on the cheap goodies. Economists say, excellent, let their government spend money supporting that industry so we get cheaper stuff and they can't be competitive in other areas.
Great.
Guys, you're familiar with the Cold War, right? Russia. Do you know how President Reagan pretty much brought them to their knees, collapsed the Soviet Union, outspent them? Outspent them. We had more GNP, we had more ability to spend on newer weapons, more weapons, and we just spent them into the ground to the point where they couldn't compete anymore. Okay. Our consumers are going to be way better off if we're importing that foreign government subsidized stuff. And any losses to our producers are going to be way offset by the fact that our consumers have so much more surplus. Isn't this awesome? Protection as a bargaining chip. We want something from them, and we can get it by essentially extorting them with our threat of trade protection. If the French won't import American moo cows, we won't import French wine. That'll show them. We've actually played this game with Japan over beef.
We had beef over beef.
We've had beef over beef, yes. We've had beef over beef with a lot of countries. Mexico doesn't want American beef either.
Why not?
Because they like Mexican beef. They've got great cattle industry in Mexico.
yeah, it's horrible.
Okay.
Compared to.
So now here's your problem. What if France says,
I know,
Sir,
there's beef in the world.
we do not care. There are plenty others who will drink our wonderful French wine. We do not need your American beef. So then what are we like? Because what do American consumers want?
Wine food.
There are some American consumers who want some of that French wine. Right?
So,
What's one option? The U.S. goes, oh, well, oh, shucks, we'll take the wine anyway, right? Or stand our ground and say, all right then, no wine, which reduces consumer surplus in the U.S., and the lack of exportation of the French or American beef to France reduces producer surplus. Well, the French were refusing to import American beef, so that producer surplus was gone anyway. Now we've just gone and compounded the situation by reducing consumer surplus by refusing the importation of the wine. We took a bad situation and made it worse. Excellent. Or we say, oh shucks, we'll take that wine anyway. We keep our consumer surplus, but we look like
Idiot.
Pushovers.
David!
life lesson here, and aside from economics, ultimatums, ladies and gentlemen, are usually never a good situation to be in. Don't issue an ultimatum unless you're willing to back it up and suffer the inevitable self-consequences of an ultimatum. Have you ever, in an argument with your parents, said, fine then, I just won't ever?
Eat again.
Yeah.
And then I was snacking
Or-
5 minutes.
Oh, here's a good toddler one. I'm just gonna hold my breath until.
They do
That's
that
an
in just
ultimatum,
with
guys.
me when she wants to.
And since you're all sitting here, I'm guessing you eventually gave up.
I think you can pass out.
I never.
I will watch that.
All right. So, trade agreements are a tool that we use. We can liberalize trade, meaning open it up with unilateral reductions in trade restrictions. Guys, NAFTA is a huge example of a unilateral reduction in trade restriction. The Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement would have been a unilateral reduction in trade restrictions. Multilateral agreements with other nations. Many nations. So unilateral is one nation with another nation. Multilateral, NAFTA. All the North American countries. Unilateral would be an agreement between France and the US over the beef and the wine. Okay. Almost 25 years we've had NAFTA in place. Actually, in January, we'll be in our 25th year of NAFTA.
Maybe.
Silver anniversary party for NAFTA.
We might be
Oh, I know how. Let's celebrate. Let's repeal it.
Let's have it.
Let's get a divorce.
After
Love
food
it.
day.
I just wanted a food.
The GATT agreements continue in place. They don't get much press. And the World Trade Organization. This is a global organization. It meets. You often see in the news where there are protests whenever they meet.
Why?
Generally, an issue with one of the member nations of the WTO. They don't have labor protections in place for youth or women or that kind of thing.
So they're saying stop trading with them because they can't protect the children. The kiddos.
I work in a sweatshop.
No, you don't.
Where do you work?
I said I would work in a sweatshop.
All right. So bottom line, trade is good. Importation and exportation, great if the right people have comparative advantage. Tariffs, bad. Quotas, bad. Some arguments in favor of trade restrictions, okay, if evaluated carefully. Most arguments in opposition to or in support of trade restrictions, invalid. The end. You have 5 end of chapter problems. Some of them are multi-part. You have a little time to get started so that you remember to finish. Remember, if you haven't already posted on the World Trade discussion, to get that done. And remember that you need to not only post an original post, but you need to comment or reply to another student's post as well. I am not going to be here tomorrow. I am going to finally be seen for my sinus infection.
Wednesday.
So what are we doing
Wednesday.
tomorrow?
So tomorrow you are still going over the end of chapter problems. I will leave the answer booklet out, and you may reference it.
Is that what we're doing all hours? Or just
Who's ours?
Mr. Holscher will be here with you.
Wait, did everybody?
English teacher. They're on campus.
Let's hope.
That's so much work.